Hello everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another edition in our ever-going Unrated Underappreciated movie review series, and this edition we will concentrate on a tough, gritty crime crop thriller, To Live and Die in LA. Released in November the 1st, 1985, it stars William Peterson, William Dafoe, John Franco, John Turturro and Dean Stockwell. It was directed by William Friedkin. The setup here is that we follow the story of Secret Service agent Richard Chance, played by William Peterson, who has worked long time with his partner who is shortly due for retirement. Their last assignment is an ongoing pursuit of the counterfeit money racketeer James Masters, played by William Dafoe. After his partner is killed staking out Masters, Richard Chance goes on an unrelenting quest for revenge and will use any method he can to apprehend Masters. He has to work with new partner John Volkovich, played by John Franco, who in contrast is more procedural, wanting to do things by the book. As the two pursue Masters, we come across various individuals, all with their own agendas, and a simple case of apprehending the criminal becomes a lot more complicated as the cops become uncertain of who to trust, who's on the right side of the law. We get various double crosses and duplicitous figures with high influences. We suddenly ask, where is the line between cop and criminal, justice and corruption, who can be trusted, where are the lines and how far can we cross those lines before there's no going back? So what's good then about To Live and Die in LA? Well, To Live and Die in LA is a very dark, tough, gritty crop thriller, every bit drenched in that classic 80s aesthetic. It's full of unpredictable twists and turns, with a full assortment of duplicitous characters that really makes the film fascinating to watch. When I think of the 80s, especially the early part of that era, I look at it in particular, as much of the movies that came out, as very clear and concise in terms of who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, the force of good and the force of evil. Well, To Live and Die in LA very much breaks those typical conventions and traditions, and it's all the better for it. It has a very unique and almost alien feel towards it, despite, as I mentioned before, having that very typical feel of 80s look and sound. This definitely is not your typical cop thriller, and that's what I love about the film so much. There's a lot of atmosphere. Despite the daylight scenes, it still very feels like a nocturnal film. It's very raw, it's very edgy, and it's also very unrelenting in its violence. There are many tough, violent scenes, and most of the time no character is safe, and that's what makes it brilliant for the most part. I think a lot of today's audiences will enjoy this film because it's very ambiguous. A lot of characters move forward really to protect themselves and their own statuses, and that's what makes it very unpredictable and fascinating to watch. Directed by William Friedkin, who, if you are a major movie fan, you'll know he's most famous for directing the iconic movies The French Connection in 1971, starring Gene Hackman as Papa Ardor, and even more revered and controversially, The Exorcist a couple of years later in 1973. Many still regard that as one of the greatest horror films of all time. He also directed the very underrated movie Cruising in 1980, starring Al Pacino. And like those films, To Live and Die in LA is a very stark and controversial, where there are simply no easy answers, nothing is sugar-coated, there's no sentimentality about this movie at all. And I think it represented a lot that shift that we got from the early part of the 80s to the latter part, where more and more violent films, in terms of their tone and their subject matter and their characters, were really coming forward more into the mainstream. There is a great cast who perform these fascinating characters. We have, of course, William Peterson as Richard Chance, and I think you could assume him as the protagonist of the story. He's very reckless, he's got that really typical attitude that you would expect from a road cop, so much that we would identify within the 1980s. He's constantly bending and breaking the rules, and he's very much of a fiery personality, and I think Peterson plays him brilliantly. We'll probably know him more now for the CSI detective series, but I think he's absolutely fantastic in this role here. And despite the fact that he's got a very who cares attitude, I think you're still on the side of him. He, at the end of the day, he just wants to get revenge for what happens to his partner, and I think that's what compels him to you as a character. He's very well complemented by John Franco as John Volkovich, who is the complete opposite of Chance. He's much more nervous and less decisive, and his main motivation is always about sticking to the principles and the rules and the procedures and the police force. And it's a great contrast between the two characters. You wonder who will crack first under the pressure. On one hand, we have Chance, who's, as the movie progresses, is willing to take even more risks in order to apprehend Masters. And on the other hand, you have Volkovich, who is much more edgy and becomes a lot more paranoid about his own position and his own status as Chance continues to take these further risks in order to apprehend Masters. We also have Dean Stockwell, who plays Bob Grimes, who's the attorney lawyer for Masters, but it's very strange in this film because he seems to be a client of nearly all of the characters involved. This goes again to what I said before about having these duplicitous characters, and I think Stockwell plays him very well. I'll always have a fondness for Dean Stockwell because I know him most from his role as Al in Quantum Leap, still for me one of the greatest television series of all time, and I think Stockwell plays his character very well. In the beginning, Bob Grimes is very cool, calm and collected, but as things escalate, he himself starts worrying about his own position, and we see he's not hesitant at all to double cross whoever he needs to make sure that he stays on the right side of the law. We have John Turturro, who probably today's viewers probably recognise him most from the Transformers movies. He has a much smaller role here as one of Masters' associates who gets busted quite early on within the film and ends up being a potential loose end for Masters, and he's constantly paranoid about who's out to get him, and I think it's a very decent performance from a limited screen time that Turturro has. And finally, we get a great performance from a very youthful looking William Dafoe as Masters. He's very intelligent, methodical, yet not afraid at the same time to take care of business himself. He has this sense of honour that he's constantly underlying, where if you give him the money up front, he will always deliver for his clients. He will always see them done right by. But at the same time, if you double cross him, then he won't hesitate at all to gain revenge or seek retribution. And I think it's a fascinating villain that we've created on it. I think it's the beginning, or definitely sowing the seeds of what we would see later on within the 80s, when we were kind of veering away from those more physically imposing villains and gearing towards the more suave, the much more intelligent and much more savvy, smaller in size antagonists. And I think William Dafoe is really brilliant and fantastic here. He's one of those underrated actors, I feel, that I think deserves a much more bigger career than what he has gone on to have. You know, we primarily know him from the Spider-Man movies when he plays Norman Osborn, but he's played several roles, you know, much more smaller independent roles. We know him recently as The Lighthouse, where he starred alongside Robert Pattinson. But overall, I think he's a very sound and a very good, clever actor, and I think he deserves far more recognition than what he receives throughout his career. The other distinctive element of this film is the soundtrack and the score, featuring songs by the 80s group Wan Chung. Both the songs and soundtrack really do give that feeling that you really are in an immersive 80s style production on here, and I don't think it's an 80s soundtrack that is so typically cheesy. I think it's rather cool and provides a lot of energy. You know, we get a lot of prolonged scenes, particularly in the early part of the film, where we see Masters going about his operations, counterfeiting the money. And I think when you have a prolonged sequence like this, where it's not necessarily an action scene, it always helps that you have a cool, energetic, dynamic soundtrack to really just keep the pace and the energy of the film flowing and keep the viewer interested. And I think that's what's distinctive about this soundtrack. I particularly love both the songs at the beginning and the end of the movie. At the beginning, you have the title song, To Live and Die in LA, of course, when we see the security service agents at the beginning. This precedes a particularly quite stark scene where they're chasing a suicide bomber, and then we get the song Wait at the end credits as well. And I just think the soundtrack is great, and this is another great example within the 80s of how much more the soundtrack can help enhance the viewing experience of the movie. As well as the soundtrack, To Live and Die in LA also features, for me, one of the greatest car chase sequences in all of cinema. This follows a sequence throughout the movie where, having gone to extreme lengths to apprehend Masters, both Chance and Vulovich find themselves suddenly under heavy fire, and what follows is an epic sequence of mayhem. It's raw, it's uncoordinated, it's frantic, and it's simply glorious to watch. You know, we often complain a lot about modern movies, and particularly the current action movies and the sequences that we see so much, and we often bemoan the overuse of shaky cam and jump cuts, excessive edits, green screen, and I think when you watch sequences like this in To Live and Die in LA, this is the reason why, because this car chase sequence alone, it must run for at least close to 5-10 minutes, and it's so typical of the 80s where we had real cars and real stunt work, and the camera work was more fluid, and you would get a lot more wider shots where you could see everything that's going on, and it really had that more of a primitive visual feel about it. You know, you really could get a visual understanding of where the characters are, particularly in this scene where we get particular close-ups of both Chance and Vulovich, and we see almost the feelings that's going on through their minds as they're dodging bullets and reversing around other cars and driving through the wrong way of traffic. It truly is an epic sequence. You know, I would probably hold it almost up there with the likes of Mad Max 2 and Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of those true epic continuous sequences. There's no quick edits, there's no musical score to try and heighten the atmosphere. It's just clear, raw and unedited, and it looks fantastic. And I think it's a lesson to learn for many filmmakers today. You know, we see so much effort going into try and engage the viewer, and so much gimmicks being used, as I mentioned before, but sometimes less is more, and sometimes you just need to film these action sequences as it is, as it happens, and you get much more of that maximized effect. And this is one of those fantastic epic action sequences that I think so many modern movies could learn from today. So if I had to give a score for To Live and Die in LA, I would give it an 8.4 out of 10. It's tough, it's bleak, it's dark, it's very uncompromising, and the violence is very shocking. And I think it's just fascinating, and I actually think it's something that would actually play very well today's audiences as well if it were released in this current climate. So if we look at the overall release of To Live and Die in LA, on a budget of 6 million, it managed to gross over 17.3 million in the US. So whilst making back its budget, it wasn't exactly a box office blockbuster. And to be honest, films of this nature, where it's very dark and violent, it's not really going to appeal to a mainstream audience. As I mentioned before, when you're dealing with 1985, we were still in more of the more innocent era, if you like, of movie making that was influencing the mainstream. So whether we had the Rocky franchise or the Karate Kid or Ghostbusters, you know, those franchises really were much more spirited and much more clear cut in who was the hero and who was the villain, much more simple, accessible movies. We look at Back to the Future as well. So To Live and Die in LA wasn't really going to distinguish itself amongst this climate of movies. Now, if you'd have shifted this movie, I think maybe perhaps 2 years later, when we were in the era of Lethal Weapon and The Untouchables and Predator and Die Hard, I think it may have found a much more successful status within mainstream cinema. Maybe perhaps as well, the lack of a truly A-list action star probably is what also failed to translate towards modern audiences. Now, when you go back in the 80s, it was very much the era of the modern day A-list superstars. So you look at the likes of Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger and Tom Cruise and Mel Gibson, of course, later on. And prior before that, you had the likes of Clint Eastwood and Burt Reynolds and Robert Redford. I think if you had an A-list actor of that mainstream success and caliber, it might have garnered more attention for To Live and Die in LA. Now, I will always preface this, as I do with all of these reviews, that just because you have a much more of a prolific actor, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a better movie, but it just means that you may have more box office success than what the film fails to appreciate on its release. So those are my thoughts on the review of To Live and Die in LA. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you've already seen the movie, how do you think it ranks amongst the true pantheon of great 80s cop thriller? Do you think the soundtrack and the musical score is what really elevates it? Do you like the dark and unrelenting and much more ambiguous atmosphere towards its characters, and the fact that it doesn't play as a typical by the numbers cop thriller? Or do you think that's what works against it, the fact that we don't really have a clear good guy or bad guy, and it's very unconventional in its approach? Everything from the beginning to the end, it doesn't really feel like a more accessible movie. And do you think is that what really hurt it at the box office? So those are my thoughts for now. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and also hit those like and subscribe buttons to help me provide you more content like this in the future. If you have a film that you think is unappreciated and underrated, let me know in the comments below, and if I've seen it, I will also try and provide a review for it in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.